Lord Mountbatten commanded every Allied soldier, sailor, and airman in Southeast Asia. And after the war, he said this man was the finest general the Second World War produced. The Japanese commander this man destroyed had his own word for it. He called the campaign that beat him a masterstroke of the war. So here's a fair question. If the man who led the Allies rated him the best, and the enemy who fought him agreed, why has almost nobody heard his name? When Britain made its victory film about the Burma campaign in 1945, the first 50 minutes went to other men. He appeared in the last 10. His own soldiers had already given their army a nickname. They called themselves the Forgotten Army. And it turned out the country was about to forget the general too. His name was William Slim. And the strangest part of his story is where it starts. Because he didn't begin this war with a victory. He began it with one of the longest retreats in the entire history of the British Army. Nearly 1,000 miles on foot through jungle, chased the whole way by an enemy that everyone, on both sides, believed simply couldn't be beaten. And then, 3 years later, that same broken army handed Japan the biggest defeat on land it suffered in the entire war. That's not luck. That's not weight of numbers. That's a mind at work. So in this video, we're going to walk through 3 tactical moves that carried Bill Slim from the worst day of his career to one of the most complete victories of the whole war. Not 3 battles he fell into by accident. 3 problems that should have been impossible, and the precise way he cracked each one. And as we go, keep a running score in your head, because at the end, I'm going to ask you which of the 3 was the real work of genius. Hold on to that question. Let's start at the bottom, in the jungle of Burma, where the story of the greatest British general almost nobody talks about actually begins. To understand the first move, you have to understand how bad 1942 really was. Japan had just done the unthinkable. Singapore, the fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, surrendered in a matter of weeks. It was the worst defeat in British military history, and it happened in the space of a fortnight, tens of thousands of British and Indian soldiers marching into captivity. Forces right across Asia were reeling, and in Burma, the same nightmare was unfolding. Rangoon, the capital, fell in March. Japanese infantry were driving north through the trees, and they were fighting in a way the British had no answer for. Here's what that way looked like, because it matters for the whole rest of the story. Instead of hitting a defensive line head-on, a Japanese column would melt into the jungle, slip around the flank, and reappear behind the British position, straddling the one dirt road that fed it. Cut the road, and you cut the food, the ammunition, the way out. Every single time it happened, the defenders had to choose. Abandon the line and pull back, or stay and be destroyed. It was less like being beaten in battle and more like being slowly strangled. Into that, in the middle of March, they dropped a corps commander who'd been running operations over in Iraq, William Slim. They handed him the wreckage of 2 divisions, grouped together now as Burma Corps, and gave him a job that really came down to a single word: survive. And the numbers were brutal. The Corps started at around 42,000 men. By the end, it had lost roughly 13,000 of them, killed, wounded, or missing. It went into the retreat with 150 field guns and came out the far side with 28. The monsoon was closing in, which in Burma doesn't mean a rainy afternoon. It means the tracks dissolve into rivers of mud. And between his men and the safety of India lay nearly 1,000 miles of some of the most punishing country on the planet. Now this is the point where most commanders lose an army completely. And I want to be clear about why, because it's the whole reason the first move counts as tactical genius and not just good housekeeping. A fighting retreat under pressure is considered the single hardest operation in all of warfare. The moment soldiers decide it's every man for himself, an army stops being an army and becomes a crowd. And a crowd running through a jungle gets butchered from behind. Slim's move wasn't a secret weapon, it was harder than that. He refused to let the retreat turn into a rout. He ran the whole withdrawal on one ruthless principle. The army would fall back in bounds, and at each bound a rear guard of riflemen would turn and fight, holding the enemy just long enough for everyone else to pull back, then leapfrog through the next position and do it again. Fight, move, cover. Fight, move, cover. For hundreds of miles. He kept units together. He kept them in their ranks. He kept them carrying their weapons and, crucially, carrying their wounded, even as men dropped from malaria and dysentery and sheer exhaustion. And this is where you get the first real glimpse of the man himself. There's a story from one of the worst moments of the retreat in a jungle clearing where Slim came across a unit that had fallen apart. Then he saw why. The officers were building themselves shelters while their men had nothing. He climbed onto an ammunition box and told them, to their faces, that as officers they would not eat, nor drink, nor sleep, nor smoke, nor even sit down, until they'd personally seen that every one of their men had done so first. Do that, he said, and they'll follow you to the end of the world, and if you don't, I'll break you. That's the thing that held the retreat together, not a diagram, a standard. They made it. In May 1942, just as the monsoon broke, the survivors crossed into India. Slim stood on the Imphal plain and watched them come in, gaunt, ragged, sick, and still, somehow, marching in formation with their rifles on their shoulders. His own words were, they might look like scarecrows, but they looked like soldiers too. Now, by any honest measure, this was a defeat. And I'm not going to dress it up as anything else, but look hard at what that defeat actually bought. The Japanese had set out to destroy Burma Corps as a fighting force. They failed. The army survived. And something else survived with it. Something Slim carried out of that jungle that would matter more than any road or bridge. He had just watched, up close and for nearly 1,000 miles, exactly how the Japanese won. The infiltration, the flanking, the strike at the supply line. He'd felt the whole machine work on him over and over. Most generals who take a beating like that spend the rest of their lives explaining whose fault it was. Slim did the opposite. He sat down and studied the defeat. Quick question before we get to the second move, because I'm genuinely curious where people land. If you'd just survived that retreat, would you have gone straight back on the attack, or spent a year rebuilding first? Have a think about what you'd have done, because what Slim actually did surprised almost everyone around him. The man who'd just lost the longest retreat in British history had quietly worked out how the entire trick was done, and in 2 years, he was going to turn it around and use it on them. By early 1944, Slim was a different commander, with a very different army. He now led the 14th Army, and he'd spent a year rebuilding it from the boots up. New jungle training that taught his men to stop fearing the trees. Malaria discipline so strict that letting yourself get sick became a punishable offense, which drove his sickness rates down and his fighting strength up. But the heart of it was this. He took the exact lesson the Japanese had taught him in 1942, and he turned it inside out. Remember what had beaten him. The Japanese got behind you, cut your supply line, and the fear of being surrounded made you run. So Slim asked the question nobody else in that army was asking. What if being surrounded simply didn't matter anymore? He put it to his commanders in a written directive, and the wording tells you everything about how his mind worked. His troops, he said, must get used to having Japanese in their rear, and they were to regard not themselves, but the Japanese, as surrounded. Sit with that for a second. He was telling his men that the enemy appearing behind you, the thing that had triggered 2 years of retreats, wasn't a catastrophe. It was a gift, provided you'd prepared for it. Prepared how? With one thing the 1942 Army never had: aircraft. If a surrounded unit could be fed and armed from the air, dropped its supplies by parachute from transport planes, then it no longer needed the road at all. And if it didn't need the road, then the enemy cutting the road achieved precisely nothing. The unit just stopped, formed a solid block, and kept fighting, while the Japanese who had surrounded it slowly starved on supplies they'd planned to capture. In February 1944, the theory got its first real test, and it wasn't a gentle one. Slim's 15th Corps was pushing into the Arakan, the coastal strip of jungle and paddy field in western Burma, when the Japanese launched a counterattack straight out of the old playbook. On the 5th and 6th of February, a Japanese force slipped through a gap in the lines, swung north, and on the 7th overran the headquarters of the 7th Indian Division. Its commander, Messervy, barely got out. Clerks and radio operators smashed their own equipment and ran for their lives. 2 years earlier, that single blow would have kicked off another long retreat to India. Not this time. The men fell back to a supply dump in a clearing at a place called Sinswaya, and they dug in. The British press ended up calling it the admin box, because that's really all it was: the administrative area, the stores, and the field hospital. It was held by one of the strangest garrisons of the war: cooks, drivers, muleteers, clerks, and a handful of tank crews. And instead of running, they did the one thing Slim had drilled into them. They formed a box, and they held it. The first days were desperate. Japanese infantry pressed in from every side. They overran the field hospital inside the perimeter and murdered patients and staff, an atrocity that hardened every man who heard about it. And still, the question hung in the air: where were the promised supplies? Then the Spitfires arrived overhead and swept the Japanese planes out of the sky, and the moment the British owned the air, the transports came. Parachutes started falling into the box. Across the battle, something like 1,600 tons of supplies floated down out of the clouds. Now watch the trap close, and watch it from the Japanese side, because this is the beautiful part. They'd done everything right by their own book. They'd surrounded the enemy, exactly as they always did. But this enemy wasn't running, and this enemy wasn't starving. The men in the box had food and bullets raining from the sky. The Japanese had come in light, carrying only what they could haul through the jungle, betting everything on seizing British stores to feed themselves. And those stores were now sitting inside a ring of tanks and artillery they couldn't break into. So the surrounding army was the one that began to starve. By the 22nd of February, one of their own brigade commanders flatly refused to attack again until his men were fed. The besiegers had become the besieged. When the relief force punched through, the box had held. The British lost around 2,000 men. In the jungle around the perimeter, they counted roughly 5,000 Japanese dead. And the official British history put its finger on exactly why this mattered so much. It was, they wrote, the first time in the whole campaign that the Japanese enveloping tactic, the flank and the cut supply line that had terrorized the British for 2 years, failed to do what they expected. Slim himself called the admin box the turning point in the Burma campaign. The legend of Japanese invincibility in the jungle, the thing that had haunted his men since Singapore, was finished. And Slim had broken it not with more men, and not with better weapons, but with an idea. He'd taken the enemy's single best move, the encirclement, and turned it into a trap for the man throwing it. If you had a moment there where the plan just clicked into place, drop the word box in the comments. I want to see how many of you saw it coming. Because the box was still only defense. It proved the Japanese could be stopped. Slim didn't want to stop them. He wanted to destroy them. And for that, he was going to have to stop reacting to the enemy and start getting inside his head. By early 1945, the whole picture had flipped. The Japanese invasion of India had been smashed at Imphal and Kohima. Now Slim was the one on the attack, driving south to take Burma back, and only one great obstacle stood in his path: the Irrawaddy. A vast brown river, in places well over a mile wide, held along its whole length by the Japanese Burma Area Army under General Kimura. And Slim had a problem that looked exactly like the one Kimura was hoping to hand him. To take central Burma, he had to cross that river straight into a defended bank, and he didn't have anywhere near enough bridging equipment to force a big opposed crossing by brute strength. If he battered his way across near Mandalay, where Kimura expected him, he'd be throwing his men at the enemy's strongest point, and that river could become a graveyard. So, Slim decided not to attack the strength at all. He went after the mind. He looked at the map and found the real prize, and it wasn't Mandalay. 80 miles further south sat a town called Meiktila. It was the beating heart of the entire Japanese position, the road hub, the rail hub, the supply dumps, the airfields. Nearly everything feeding the Japanese armies in the north flowed through Meiktila. Take it, and the whole Japanese defense of central Burma would wither on the vine. So he built a plan that's, honestly, one of the most elegant things in the war, and he called it Operation Extended Capital. The idea was to let Kimura believe precisely what Kimura already wanted to believe. Slim sent one corps, his 33rd Corps, driving openly toward Mandalay from the north, making all the noise, drawing all the eyes, looking for all the world like the main attack. It was a feint, a very loud, very convincing feint. Meanwhile, in total secrecy, he peeled his other corps, the 4th Corps, right off the line and sent it on one of the most audacious moves of the entire war. Roughly 300 miles down a jungle valley to the south, the men literally building their own road as they went, with fake radio traffic left crackling away behind them so Japanese listeners would think the corps was still sitting up north. An entire corps, tanks and all, simply vanished off the map and reappeared hundreds of miles away, at a stretch of the Irrawaddy that Kimura had barely bothered to garrison because he was staring in the wrong direction. On the 13th and 14th of February 1945, they crossed at Nyanghu. And here's a detail that tells you the scale of the nerve involved. It was the longest opposed river crossing attempted in any theater of the entire Second World War, the river at that point running over 2,000 yards wide. And Slim's deception had aimed it precisely at the seam between two Japanese armies, the single weakest point on the whole river line. Now here's the moment the war in Burma actually turns, and it turns inside one man's head. Reports reached Kimura of a crossing down in the south. He didn't believe them. The deception had worked so completely that he was convinced the true threat was still up at Mandalay. He knew the British had only 2 tank brigades in the whole of Burma, and he was certain both of them were in the north, so this crossing had to be a diversion, maybe just a screen of African troops. He waved it away. By the time he understood what was really happening, it was far too late. A British armored column was already tearing across open country toward Meiktila, which was held by only about 4,000 men, many of them clerks and hospital staff. And when the truth finally reached the Japanese command, one of the officers ordered to defend the place said the quiet part out loud. "Isn't there some mistake?" he asked. "How can the enemy be so close in these back areas?" There was no mistake. Meiktila fell. And the instant it did, Slim sprang the second half of the trap, the half he'd designed from the very first day. Losing Mike Tila was a wound Kimura couldn't leave untreated. His only option was to rip his forces away from the Mandalay front and hurl them south to win it back, which meant his army came pouring out of its prepared defenses and threw itself at Slim's men, on exactly the ground Slim had chosen. Mike Tila was the anvil, the corps up north was the hammer, and the Japanese Burma area army was crushed between the two. It broke Japan in Burma for good. Mandalay fell. The road to Rangoon swung open, and General Kimura, the man on the receiving end of every bit of it, gave the plan the name that history kept. He called it the masterstroke of the war. Think about the full circle in that. The general who spent 1942 being flanked, deceived, and cut off over nearly 1,000 miles of jungle had just done all three of those things to his enemy on a scale the Japanese never saw coming, and with their own favorite tricks. So that's the arc of Bill Slim in 3 moves. In 1942, he saved an army by refusing to let a defeat become a massacre, and he studied the men who beat him instead of blaming them. In 1944, he took their single best weapon, the encirclement, and turned it into a trap. And in 1945, he outdeceived the masters of deception and destroyed them with it. The finest general of the war, in the words of the man who commanded him. The author of a masterstroke, in the words of the enemy he broke. And still, somehow, the one left out of the story. Britain's forgotten general. So here's the question I asked you to hold on to at the start. Which of the 3 was the real stroke of genius? The retreat that saved the army, the box that broke the myth, or the masterstroke that won the war? I've got my answer, but I'd rather hear yours. So tell me in the comments, and tell me why. And if you want to help make sure this general doesn't stay forgotten, sharing this with one person who loves history does more than any algorithm ever will. Next time, we're looking at the British general who beat Napoleon at his own game, at Waterloo. Subscribe so you don't miss it. See you again soon.